Between Rome and China, a dynasty of steppe warriors forged an empire from horseback. When Arsaces raised his banner against Greek rule in 247 BC, none imagined his descendants would rule for 5 centuries. From Kaure's sands, where Roman legions perished, to the silk-laden caravans of Merv, the Parthians mastered the art of survival through adaptation. Their cataphracts thundered across Mesopotamia, while their merchants whispered in a dozen tongues. Though Persian fire eventually consumed what nomad arrows had built, the Arsacid legacy endured in every curved bow and diplomatic treaty from Armenia to India, proving empires need not choose between tradition and transformation. Dust still clung to the ruins of Persepolis when the armies of Alexander the Great pressed eastward. Behind them, the smoke of conquered cities drifted across the Iranian plateau, curling like ghostly banners over the bones of the fallen. The old empire of Cyrus and Darius had been broken, its treasures scattered among Macedonian generals who believed themselves masters of Asia. Yet far from the marble palaces of Babylon or Susa, beyond the easy reach of royal decree, the eastern provinces, Parthia, Hyrcania, and Bactria, watched in wary silence. They bowed to the conqueror because they must, but their allegiance was thin as parchment. Beneath that stillness, resentment began to gather like a storm behind the mountains. For all his brilliance, Alexander ruled briefly and knew little of these lands. The Parthian plain, framed by the Kopet Dag Range and the Karakum Desert, was no cradle of submission. Here, horsemen rode lean and silent, their lives bound to the rhythm of the wind and the spear. When word came of the king's death in Babylon, many among them saw not tragedy, but opportunity. Macedonian governors, now without their living god, clung to their satrapies like men gripping the last stones of a crumbling wall. Among these governors was Andragoras, a man ambitious enough to proclaim himself independent when the Seleucid Empire began to fracture. The Seleucids, Alexander's heirs in Asia, had divided his realm among themselves. They ruled from Antioch and Babylon, sending out Greek administrators to govern lands they scarcely understood. Their maps were accurate, their cities neatly founded, but their grasp upon the Iranian East was fragile. The highlands did not yield easily to order. Roads washed out in spring floods. Caravans vanished into sandstorms, and the tribes who roamed those valleys answered only to strength. Andragoras' rebellion was bold but lonely. His rule, centered in Hekatompelos, rested on borrowed coin and borrowed faith. Greek garrisons guarded cities, but the countryside belonged to the nomads. These men of the steppe, descendants of Scythians and Dahai, had watched empires rise and fall for centuries. They knew patience better than loyalty. Among them, in the harsh lands north of Parthia, rode a small clan called the Parni. Their chieftain, Arsaces, was said to have been a man of quiet resolve, born to hardship and accustomed to command. He saw what the governors could not, that the Macedonian inheritance was rotting from within. No proclamation marked the beginning of his rebellion. It began, as most revolutions do, in whispers and raids. Parni riders struck across the frontier, testing the defenses of Andragoras' towns. They vanished as swiftly as they came, leaving rumors behind them. Local farmers, weary of Greek taxation, began to supply these strangers with grain and water. In the hills, shepherds spoke the name Arsaces with reverence. By the time Andragoras gathered his mercenaries to retaliate, it was already too late. The Parni had crossed the mountains in force, their banners of horsehair fluttering like shadows on the wind. The fall of Andragoras was swift and almost unseen. Chronicles in the West mention him only briefly, another forgotten satrap swallowed by the desert. Yet to the east, it was remembered as the moment Parthia awoke. Arsaces entered Hekatompelos not as a destroyer, but as a restorer. He proclaimed himself ruler, not in the name of Greece, but of Iran. In his court, translators recited old Avestan hymns beside Greek scribes, who recorded decrees in the polished language of Alexander's heirs. From this fusion, a new kind of kingdom began to take shape, neither wholly Hellenic nor entirely Persian, but something born between the two. Arsaces understood that to endure, power must root itself in tradition. He adopted the symbols once worn by Achaemenid kings: the winged crown, the royal fire, the title of autocrator. Yet he also preserved the speed and mobility of his nomadic past. His soldiers were mounted archers, their bows curved like crescent moons, their armor light enough for the sudden strike. They could vanish into the desert and return before dawn, carrying spoils and captives. Against such warfare, the heavy phalanxes of the Seleucids found themselves helpless. At Nisa, a fertile oasis near the edge of the Karakum, Arsaces founded his first capital. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover its treasures: wine amphorae sealed with Greek inscriptions, ivory rota shaped like griffins, and more than 2,000 ostraca recording taxes, grain rations, and royal gifts. Those shards tell a story of order rising from chaos. The Pani, who had once lived by plunder, now kept accounts and minted silver coins. On those coins, the image of Arsaces appears in profile, his beard trimmed in the old Iranian style, his head bound with a Hellenistic diadem. It was a portrait meant to speak two languages at once. While the Seleucid kings in Antioch quarreled among themselves, Parthia hardened into independence. Arsaces' men patrolled the frontier against incursions from Bactria, whose Greek kings still dreamed of restoring their lost authority. They never quite managed it. The land itself seemed to favor the new dynasty: broad plains for cavalry, mountains for refuge, and trade routes that ran like veins toward the silk markets of the east. Caravans began to cross Parthia, bearing jade, silk, and lapis lazuli from beyond the Oxus. Customs houses appeared along the roads, modest at first, then guarded by soldiers in bronze helmets stamped with the royal emblem. What set Arsaces apart from other warlords was his vision of continuity. He did not seek to erase the past, but to inherit it. To the priests of fire temples, he presented himself as defender of the sacred flame. To Greek merchants, he promised protection for their caravans. Even his enemies acknowledged his prudence. When he died, around 211 BC, if later chronicles speak true, he left behind not merely conquered lands, but a foundation. His brother, Tiridates, succeeded him without bloodshed, a rare thing in Eastern monarchies. The Arsacid line, born from rebellion, had become a dynasty. Still, in these first decades, survival was fragile. The Seleucids had not forgotten their lost satrapy. Word reached Parthia that Antiochus the Great was preparing to march east, determined to reclaim what his forefathers had built. But even as that shadow gathered, Arsaces' legacy endured in the hearts of his people. They had seen that empire could be remade not in marble, but in dust, that kings might rise from riders of the steppe as easily as from heirs of Alexander. At dusk, the wind over Nisa carried the scent of dry grass and wine. In the royal courtyard, torches burned beside the old Persian fire altar, their light flickering on walls painted with griffins and lions. Here, among the mingled tongues of Greek and Iranian courtiers, a new chapter of Asia's history had begun. The banners of the Pani would ride farther yet, to Babylon, to Armenia, to the edges of Rome's ambition. But their story began in this moment of rebellion, when one man from the steppe defied the remnants of the conqueror's dream. In the silence after conquest, something ancient had stirred again. Parthia had been a name on a satrap's tablet, a forgotten province on the empire's rim. Now it had a voice, a king, and a destiny shaped by dust, horse, and flame. The age of the Arsacids had begun. At dawn, the hills around Nisa burned gold. The steppe was wide and restless, its horizon flickering with heat and mirage. Riders returned from the north, their horses streaked with foam, their arrows bundled like reeds. They brought news of peace in the valleys, of caravans resuming their course, of harvests unspoiled by war. After decades of turmoil, Parthia was breathing again. Arsaces the First had done what few men before him had dared. He had taken a forgotten satrapy and forged it into a realm that could stand against kings. He ruled as both chieftain and monarch, moving easily between the two worlds that shaped him. In his camp, he still shared bread with warriors beside the fire, speaking in the rough cadence of the steppe. Yet within his palace, he sat beneath painted ceilings that echoed the artistry of Persia's older courts. His strength lay not merely in conquest, but in his understanding of inheritance. He knew that legitimacy in Iran was not seized, it was woven. At Nisa, the desert wind carried the scent of baked clay and fermenting grapes. Builders labored to raise new walls, filling them with murals of winged bulls and rosettes, ancient symbols of protection reborn under a new banner. Greek craftsmen, drawn from captured cities, carved columns in the Corinthian style beside halls where priests tended the sacred fire. The city became a living emblem of fusion, Greek elegance married to Iranian sanctity. When visitors arrived from Bactria or Media, they were offered wine from amphorae sealed with inscriptions in both alphabets. It was diplomacy written in architecture, in ritual, and in coin. The mint at Nisa struck silver drachms bearing the image of the new ruler. His portrait was deliberate, half Greek, half Iranian. The diadem of a Hellenistic king circled his head, yet his beard followed the style of the Achaemenids, the line of Cyrus and Darius. On the reverse stood an archer, seated and poised, echoing both the god Apollo and the Iranian hero Arash. The symbolism was not lost on those who handled the coins. Each one declared that Parthia was no longer a vassal, but a house with its own gods and destiny. Still, Arsaces knew that strength alone would not secure his throne. Around him, the Seleucid world remained vast, stretching from Asia Minor to the Indus. Antiochus the Great was young, ambitious, and determined to recover what had been lost. The Eastern satrapies still murmured allegiance to Antioch's court. Even Bactria, governed by its Greek kings beyond the Oxus, eyed Parthia with suspicion. To survive, Arsaces had to balance defiance with prudence. He extended gifts to nearby rulers, sending falcons and horses as tokens of goodwill. Yet when Seleucid envoys demanded tribute, they found themselves received with honor, but dismissed without agreement. He built his power instead through people rather than parchment. Parthian nobles, once mere tribal chieftains, were bound to him through marriage and shared spoils. They brought their herds and warriors under the royal standard, forming a federation of clans loyal to the Arsacid house. Out of this fragile alliance grew the seeds of the later Parthian aristocracy. Decisions were made in council, not by decree alone. The loyalty of the great families would one day become the foundation and the peril of the dynasty. Beyond the palaces and councils, Parthia's rebirth could be measured in smaller things. Farmers returned to their fields along the Atrek River, where irrigation channels carved from the earth sparkled under the sun. Traders from the west began to appear again, their camels burdened with linen, wine, and bronze mirrors. From the east came jade, silk, and strange spices that perfumed the markets of Nisa. Tax records scratched onto pottery fragments, later unearthed by archaeologists, show the precision of this new order. They list shipments of barley, dates, and wine amphorae sent to the royal storehouses. The fragments tell of a kingdom discovering bureaucracy, the quiet machinery of permanence. In his final years, Arsaces turned his attention to the realm's identity. He commissioned scribes to record genealogies linking his house to ancient Persian heroes, tracing his lineage to the royal blood of the Achaemenids. Whether true or imagined, it lent divine weight to his crown. Priests spoke his name in their hymns, blessing him as protector of the sacred flame. The rituals of the old Zoroastrian temples, once endangered under Greek rule, flourished again. Yet Arsaces did not drive out Hellenism. He understood its power to bind his realm to the wider world. Greek remained the language of administration, its script the mark of official decrees. He was a king who ruled through inclusion, not erasure. Even so, his reign was shadowed by vigilance. The Seleucid governors of Media and Hyrcania still probed the borders, sending spies disguised as traders. From the northeast, the Sarka tribes pressed closer each year, restless beyond the Oxus. To meet them, Arsaces relied on speed. His cavalry could move across 200 miles in a week, carrying both bow and lance. Scouts signaled with mirrors by day and fire by night. It was warfare born of the plain itself, swift, elusive, merciless. When Antiochus finally marched east in 209 BC, Parthia's moment of reckoning arrived. Chronicles from the west record a brief submission, a formal acknowledgement of Seleucid overlordship. But behind the formalities, Parthian autonomy remained intact. The conqueror moved on, satisfied with gestures. The Arsacid standard still flew above Nisa. The empire had learned that survival sometimes required the wisdom to bow without kneeling. Years later, the clay archives of Nisa would preserve a strange duality. Documents sealed with Greek-style stamps beside others marked in local script. Wine from Syria shared storage with the produce of Hyrcania. Officials bore both Greek and Iranian names. This coexistence was not confusion. It was a statement. Parthia had become the hinge of civilizations, absorbing each without surrendering itself. When Arsaces died, his burial was conducted in silence and ritual. Chroniclers say his body was laid in a stone chamber beneath Nisa's citadel, surrounded by golden vessels, bows of composite horn, and coins stamped with his image. The fire priests sang prayers to guide his spirit to the light. His brother Tiridates, already seasoned by command, ascended the throne without strife, a sign that the Parthian nobility, for all their pride, had accepted the Arsacid claim as rightful. At the fading light of that succession, Parthia entered its second generation. The rebellion of nomads had become the inheritance of kings. Across the east, rumors spread of a new power rising, one that fought like the Scythians but ruled like the Persians. And somewhere in the shadow of Nisa's walls, the first chroniclers began to speak, not of Arsaces the conqueror, but of Arsaces the founder. His name, they said, would become the title of every king who followed. A reminder that the dynasty began not in palaces, but in the wind and silence of the steppe. In the centuries ahead, empires would call the Parthians barbarians, rebels, horse lords. Yet here, in this first flowering of their power, they were architects of endurance. Arsaces I had done more than win a crown. He had created a mirror through which Iran could see itself again, neither conquered nor forgotten. And from that mirror, the light of a new empire was already beginning to burn. The empire that Arsaces I had imagined did not yet exist in marble or decree. It lived instead in the loyalty of men who remembered his name and the order he had carved from chaos. When his brother Tiridates I took the diadem, Parthia remained a delicate balance between triumph and survival. Its fields were green again, its fortresses manned, but its sovereignty hung on the uncertain favor of kings to the west. Antiochus the Great, master of the Seleucid realm, had not forgotten the lands that once paid him tribute. The march eastward came like a gathering storm. Columns of Macedonian-trained soldiers crossed Media, their bronze shields flashing in the sun. For all the defiance Parthia had shown, its armies could not match the sheer weight of Seleucid numbers. Tiridates understood this. He knew that empires could crush with patience as easily as with swords. So when Antiochus demanded submission, the Parthians opened their gates and offered grain, horses, and guides. There was no shame in bending to survive. For a few years, Parthia was a vassal once more, its kings named in Seleucid records as obedient allies. Tribute flowed westward, though it was often delayed by storms or conveniently lost in the desert. In practice, little changed. Antiochus pressed onward to Bactria, leaving only garrisons behind. The conqueror's shadow passed, and in its fading light, the Arsacid realm drew breath again. The lesson was not forgotten. Sovereignty was a game of endurance, not defiance. Under Tiridates' rule, Parthia refined what Arsaces had begun. Administration deepened, and local governors, once appointed by tribal councils, were now chosen from loyal noble houses. They swore oaths on sacred fire and feasted beneath royal banners embroidered with lions and suns. The blend of nomad freedom and Persian ceremony gave the realm a strange dignity. In the great hall of Nisa, envoys from Hyrcania and Bactria were received in equal measure with merchants from Seleucia. Each brought stories of shifting powers and new opportunities. Coinage became the truest expression of independence. Silver tetradrachms appeared bearing the profile of Tiridates, with the legend Basileus Arsaku, king in the house of Arsaces. Though the title was modest, its meaning was immense. The inscription linked every ruler to the founder's memory, turning lineage into legitimacy. These coins traveled farther than the armies themselves, through caravan markets in Margiana, across the Oxus, even to Syria, where traders recognized the design and the claim it carried. Across the empire's vast frontier, signs of renewal emerged. Artisans fashioned bronze seals depicting winged deities and royal archers. Scribes recorded land grants and taxes on parchment and potsherds, their handwriting blending Greek precision with Iranian flourish. In the workshops of Nisa, clay figurines of gods and musicians began to appear, some in Hellenistic robes, others in the ancient style of the highlands. It was not imitation, but synthesis, a quiet renaissance beneath the shadow of greater powers. The Seleucid presence, meanwhile, began to fade. Antiochus had stretched his realm too far, and his successors lacked his discipline. One by one, their satraps turned self-serving. Soldiers went unpaid. Distant provinces governed themselves in all but name. Parthia, officially subordinate, became independent in all but title. No great declaration marked the change, only the steady absence of interference. It was independence achieved by attrition, not revolution. In those same decades, Parthian merchants began to follow the northern trade routes that would one day form the Silk Road. Their caravans moved cautiously through Merv and Bactria, carrying wine, wool, and precious metals to exchange for the silks of the East. With every journey, their name traveled farther. The Arsacids were no longer merely lords of a forgotten satrapy. They were a bridge between civilizations. Tiridates ruled for decades with a patience his brother might have admired. Chronicles speak of him as a man less fiery than Arsaces, but more deliberate, a builder rather than a conqueror. He oversaw the expansion of Nisa's fortifications, raised new temples to Mithra and Anahita, and ordered irrigation channels dug deep into the parched earth. Each of these projects tied the nobility to his cause. They financed construction, received royal favor, and saw their estates flourish. Loyalty was not bought with fear, but with prosperity. Yet beyond the borderlands, danger gathered again. To the west, the Seleucid kings fought wars of succession that drained their treasury and shattered their cohesion. To the east, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom under Euthydemus, and later Demetrius, grew powerful and ambitious. Rumors of invasion reached Parthia's frontier towns, Greek armies crossing the Oxus, elephants marching through the passes, but none came to Nisa. The mountains and deserts that had once isolated Parthia now served as its fortress. During these quiet years, something subtle took hold in the Parthian mind, a sense of destiny. The chroniclers began to write not merely of kings and battles, but of continuity. They spoke of an Iranian revival, of the spirit of the Achaemenids reborn in the east. To outsiders, it might have seemed hollow rhetoric, yet it captured the heart of a people who had long lived under foreign crowns. In Nisa's archives, scribes began using the title King of Kings in private correspondence, though it would not yet appear on coin or seal. The dream was already forming. The Seleucid decline accelerated after the death of Antiochus the Great. His heirs fought over fragments of an empire they could no longer control. Local revolts erupted across their dominions. Governors in Persia declared autonomy. Bactria broke away entirely. The world that had once belonged to Alexander's heirs was fracturing, and in every crack, Parthia found room to grow. Through the long arc of the century, the Arsacid realm endured by moving between caution and courage. It bent when threatened, stood when forgotten, and learned to thrive in the spaces between greater powers. Its coins crossed deserts. Its merchants navigated between Hellenic cities and Eastern markets. Its nobles intermarried with local dynasties from Media to Hyrcania. Without conquest, Parthia had become indispensable. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, a new generation of princes had come of age, men who had never known submission, who looked westward not with fear but with calculation. Among them was Mithridates, the son of Tiridates, a ruler in waiting whose ambitions would reshape the Iranian world. When he looked upon the map of his inheritance, he saw not a frontier kingdom, but the beginnings of an empire. As twilight deepened over Nisa, the last fires of Tiridates' reign burned low. The city stood quiet beneath the stars, its granaries full, its walls intact. The wind carried faint echoes from distant lands, rumors of Greek kings in turmoil, of nomads moving across the Oxus. Parthia listened, waiting for its moment. The time for endurance had passed. The time for expansion was near. And in the rising murmur of the east, the name of Mithridates the Great began to stir. Long before dawn, the plains around Hekatompelos shimmered under a thin mist, and from the royal stables came the quiet thunder of hooves. The young king Mithridates had risen early, restless beneath the stars. He had inherited a kingdom that had learned to endure. Now he intended to make it command. Where his forefathers had ruled from necessity, he ruled from vision. The son of Tiridates stood at the edge of the desert and saw in the distance not borders but roads, paths leading to Media, Babylonia, and the wealth of the West. He was called the Great by later chroniclers, but in his own time, his greatness was simply motion. He moved ceaselessly through mountain passes, across the Tigris, into valleys that had not seen a Parthian banner before. The empire he built did not erupt overnight. It unfolded like the steppe wind, widening, relentless, impossible to cage. From Nisa, he marched first toward Media, the old Persian heartland. Its satraps, weary of Seleucid chaos, opened their gates rather than resist. By sword and negotiation alike, Mithridates drew their allegiance, promising protection where the Greeks had offered only taxes. From Media, he turned to Babylonia. The plain of Mesopotamia was still thick with temples and cities that had outlasted a dozen conquerors. Seleucia, on the Tigris, brilliant and defiant, stood as the jewel of Hellenistic rule. To capture it was to inherit the prestige of Alexander himself. Mithridates did not rush the assault. His envoys entered the city with proclamations of clemency. His cavalry cut the roads beyond it, starving the garrison of aid. When at last Parthian troops breached its walls, the fall of Seleucia was as much a ceremony as a siege. The new ruler walked through the marble colonnades not as a barbarian invader, but as a restorer of balance. In Babylon, priests lit incense before statues that had watched the march of centuries. They read omens in the stars and declared that the gods had chosen a new guardian. Mithridates, respectful of their customs, restored temple revenues and confirmed ancient privileges. The gesture echoed across the empire. In Elam, he allowed local kings to retain their thrones. In Elime, he spared rebellious nobles after their surrender, only to face their rebellion again months later. The empire learned quickly that mercy had limits. Parthia's conquests brought new peoples beneath its banner: Greeks, Persians, Babylonians, Jews, and countless tribes between. To govern them, Mithridates devised a dual system. In the Iranian highlands, the old aristocracy held their estates under royal charter. In the Greek cities of Mesopotamia, civic councils continued to meet, their autonomy preserved so long as taxes arrived on time. Greek remained the language of coinage and trade, Persian the tongue of ceremony and faith. The result was an empire fluent in contradiction. Commerce flourished under this new order. The caravan routes from India through Bactria now met the Euphrates Road at Parthian toll stations, where officials stamped ledgers in two scripts. Silver flowed westward, silk eastward, and from the exchange came wealth beyond measure. Parthian coinage multiplied, two systems, twin mirrors of empire. The Greek cities minted tetradrachms bearing Mithridates' Hellenistic portrait. The Iranian mints struck local drachms with inscriptions invoking divine favor. The king's image changed with his audience, youthful and beardless for the cities, stern and crowned with rays for the heartlands. Each design whispered allegiance to a different tradition, yet both declared the same authority. The wealth that filled the treasuries of Nisa and Seleucia transformed Parthian architecture. Palaces rose on terraces faced with stucco reliefs of hunting scenes and winged spirits. Mosaics depicted the sun, god Mithra, riding across the heavens, his torch blazing over the royal figure below. Artisans fused Eastern and Western motifs until neither could be separated. Even the king's throne combined styles, Greek lions supporting an Iranian fire altar. Beyond such splendor, Mithridates' genius lay in his sense of continuity. He claimed descent not only from Arsaces I, but through him from Cyrus the Great. At ceremonies, he wore a high tiara instead of a Greek diadem, and adopted the ancient Persian title King of Kings. For the first time since the fall of Persepolis, that title carried substance. Governors and client rulers swore loyalty in its name. In their oaths, Parthia became more than a realm. It became a rebirth. His reign was not without peril. The Seleucid Empire, though wounded, was not yet dead. Antiochus VII mounted a counteroffensive, seeking to reclaim the east. The two powers clashed across Mesopotamia in a campaign of sieges and counter-sieges that tested the endurance of both. For a moment, it seemed the tide might turn against Parthia, but Antiochus's victories were fleeting. His supply lines stretched thin, his soldiers faltered in the desert heat, and the old cohesion of the Greek kingdoms dissolved. When the last Seleucid withdrew westward, he left behind more than empty fortresses. He left the acknowledgement that the East no longer belonged to his kind. In the wake of conquest, Mithridates faced a subtler challenge, governing an empire whose core had doubled overnight. His solution was as pragmatic as it was bold. He established Ctesiphon across the river from Seleucia, a counterbalance to the proud Greek metropolis. There, near the banks of the Tigris, the Parthian court found a home midway between the steppe and the city. Greek architects built its halls, but Iranian priests sanctified its altars. From that dual capital, Parthia would rule for centuries. Religious tolerance became one of his most lasting policies. Jewish communities in Babylon found themselves protected under royal edict, their synagogues untaxed and their judges autonomous. Zoroastrian fire temples flourished beside shrines to Apollo and Artemis. In the empire's mosaic of faiths, no creed was crushed so long as it offered prayers for the king. It was a politics of equilibrium that turned diversity into stability. By the end of Mithridates' reign, Parthia stretched from the borders of India to the banks of the Euphrates. Messengers on swift horses could take weeks to cross its breadth. Fortresses crowned every mountain pass. Royal caravans carried gifts and decrees sealed with emerald and gold. To the Romans, who were just beginning to look eastward, this was a land of legend, an empire risen from the desert, ruled by a people who could vanish on horseback, and yet command cities older than Rome itself. When Mithridates died, the court at Ctesiphon plunged into mourning. Chroniclers say his body was carried to Nysa, laid beside the founder's tomb, and that a flame burned there for 7 days without wind or fuel. Whether true or not, the tale captures what he became, a man who turned endurance into dominion. His passing did not end Parthia's rise. It marked the moment when the kingdom of rebels became an empire of kings. In the silence that followed his burial, the world around him changed. To the west, Rome's legions began their steady crawl through Syria. To the east, nomadic tribes gathered strength along the steppes. Parthia stood between them, immense, glittering, and vulnerable. Yet for now, under the long shadow of Mithridates the Great, it seemed untouchable, a power reborn from dust, and for a moment, master of all the lands the sunrise could reach. The empire Mithridates the Great had carved from dust did not die with him, but its edges trembled. The grandeur of his reign lingered in marble halls, and in the memory of those who had seen his banners rise over Babylon. Yet power that vast never passes peacefully. When he was carried to his tomb at Nysa, the unity he had built rode with him. The throne passed to his son Phraates, and from that moment, the calm surface of Parthian rule began to crack. Phraates inherited an empire too wide for its roads and too young for its crown. The nobles who had once bowed to his father now argued over precedence. Governors in the far provinces demanded more autonomy, and soldiers who had fought under Mithridates expected reward rather than obedience. In the west, Babylon simmered with old resentments. In the east, new storms gathered. Nomadic migrations from the steppe, first whispers, then avalanches, swept down from the Oxus. The Yuezhi and the Saka moved like tides, displacing kingdoms and trampling borders. Parthia's eastern satrapies, thinly garrisoned and exhausted from years of campaigning, felt the first shock. It began with raids. Caravan posts along the Margiana frontier went silent. Then entire towns vanished, their walls blackened by fire. Refugees poured westward with tales of mounted archers swarming from the horizon, shooting even as they fled. The Parthians knew that style of war. It was their own reflection in another guise. Phraates sent his general Artabanus east with orders to contain the invaders. But the fighting blurred into chaos. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once, striking and disappearing across the dunes. In Babylon, unrest turned inward. The same scholars who had praised Mithridates now recorded omens of disfavor. The diaries that astronomers kept on clay tablets spoke of eclipses and strange stars, always linked to rebellion and defeat. Those fragments, found centuries later, preserve the rhythm of anxiety. In the month of Tebet, revolt in Seleucia. In the month of Adaru, the army of the king did not return. The heavens, it seemed, had begun to mirror the disorder of the earth. Phraates ruled with suspicion, trusting few. He ordered purges within the court, accusing nobles of conspiracy, and took hostages from great families to secure their loyalty. The very system that had given Parthia strength, the alliance of clans under one crown, now turned against him. Councils broke into factions, each favoring a different heir or general. Artabanus, returning wounded from the frontier, was received coolly and soon dead, whether by illness or command, no chronicler could say. The East was lost for a generation, the nomads carving out new realms where once Parthia had ruled. From the west came a different kind of pressure. The Seleucid kingdom, though a shadow of its former self, still clung to Syria and Mesopotamia. Antiochus VII attempted one last campaign to reclaim the lands his ancestors had lost. He crossed the Euphrates with elephants and silvered shields, sweeping through Babylonia like a storm. Parthian garrisons crumbled before his advance, and for a moment it seemed that the old empire of Alexander would rise again. Yet Antiochus overreached. His supply trains faltered, his allies deserted him, and the desert itself turned traitor. At dawn one morning, his camp was overrun by Parthian horsemen. The great king of the west was found among the fallen, his armor stripped, his crown trampled into the dust. Phraates claimed victory, but the triumph brought no peace. The war had drained his strength, and his hold on the nobles weakened further. He resorted to cruelty, executions, confiscations, banishments. Such measures bought obedience, never loyalty. By the time of his death, rebellion smoldered across every province. The succession fell to his son, Artabanus I, a man hardened by exile and war, who inherited not an empire, but a wound. Artabanus tried to heal it. He called the nobles to council, restored privileges, and sought reconciliation with the priests of Zoroaster. For a brief moment, it seemed the balance might return. Yet even as he pacified the west, the eastern steppe flared again. The Saka had not vanished. They had multiplied. Their raids reached as far as Hyrcania, and royal messengers began to vanish on the road to Merv. Artabanus led his army personally into the frontier, determined to repeat his ancestors' feats. The campaign was brutal and uncertain, fought across salt plains where thirst killed as many as arrows. In the end, the king fell in battle. his body lost among the dunes. The news reached Nisa like a curse. The court wavered, waiting for a successor who could steady the realm. Into that void stepped Phraates II, young and ambitious, but untested. He gathered what remained of the eastern forces and marched to avenge his father, only to meet the same fate. The chronicles say that the Saka surrounded him in the desert, their arrows darkening the sky, and that the Parthians fought until the sand itself turned red. When night came, the steppe was silent but for the creak of broken saddles. 2 kings dead in succession, 2 armies destroyed. Parthia had survived greater threats, but never such exhaustion. The nobles, weary of endless war, turned inward once more, defending their estates rather than the empire. For nearly a generation, the crown passed through hands more ceremonial than sovereign. The realm did not collapse, but it drifted, surviving by habit rather than design. Yet decline was not defeat. Even amid ruin, Parthia's institutions endured. The mint at Seleucia still struck silver. The fire temples of Nisa still burned. Merchants resumed their caravans when the roads cleared, and the great families kept their councils. It was as though the empire, though wounded, had learned to outlast its rulers. By the end of the 2nd century BC, the storms began to ease. A new figure rose in the east, Mithridates II, destined to rebuild what had been broken. The chroniclers would later call him the Great, as if greatness were a family inheritance. When he ascended the throne, Parthia was scarred but alive, its spirit unbroken. The rebellions had not destroyed it, they had tempered it. Far from the cities, on the open steppe where the founders had first raised their banners, the wind still carried the sound of hooves and the memory of an older defiance. The empire's heart, though bruised, beat steadily on, waiting for the next hand strong enough to guide it. Those who came of age after the great rebellions inherited a country still marked by grief, but stirring toward new beginnings. Out of that exhaustion stepped Mithridates II, a man shaped by ruin and raised to restore. The chronicles remember him as the Great, the title reclaimed and redefined. He ascended the throne at a time when the empire was fractured, its nobles suspicious, its armies depleted, and its prestige uncertain. Yet he ruled with a calm that concealed relentless purpose. Where others had sought glory in conquest, he began by rebuilding what war had undone. His first years were spent not in battle, but in restoration. Roads torn apart by nomadic incursions were repaired. Governors were recalled and reassigned. He summoned the great families, the Suren, the Karen, the Mihran, and demanded their allegiance under oaths sworn before the sacred fire. Instead of threatening their power, he bound it to his. Each noble house received lands and privileges in exchange for soldiers and silence. Through this delicate balance, Mithridates created what no Parthian before him had achieved: unity through cooperation. In the east, he confronted the lingering threat of the Saka. The nomads had established their own domains in Bactria and beyond, pressing constantly at Parthia's frontier. Rather than chasing them into the deserts as his predecessors had, Mithridates turned the tide through diplomacy and ferocity alike. He led a campaign that reclaimed the lost provinces of Margiana and Hyrcania, driving the invaders back beyond the Oxus. The victory was costly, but it restored confidence. For the first time in decades, the empire's borders were secure. With stability came ambition. Mithridates looked westward, toward Armenia and the disintegrating Seleucid kingdoms. The Mediterranean powers were stirring again. Rome's legions had reached the shores of Syria. and their governors watched the East with a conqueror's patience. The king understood that Parthia's survival lay in positioning itself between these worlds, not beneath them. Around this time, the first embassies from the Far East arrived at his court. Chinese records later described a distant kingdom called Anxi, rich in horses and metals, whose ruler dressed in embroidered robes and governed through noble clans. The Parthians, ever pragmatic, saw the advantage immediately. Their caravans began to control the roads that linked the Western world to the silk markets of China. From Merv to Hekatompilos, from there to the twin cities of Seleucia and Ctesiphon, trade caravans moved under Parthian escort. At each station, tolls and customs were levied, turning commerce into sovereignty. The Silk Road, still unnamed but already alive, became the empire's lifeline. Gold and silver from Rome, glass and textiles from Syria, spices from India, jade and silk from Han China, all passed through Parthian hands. The king created new stations at Merv and Rage, each with appointed overseers who reported directly to the royal treasury. These men, chosen from both Greek and Iranian families, formed a class of administrators that bridged Parthia's dual heritage. For their efficiency, they were granted estates and privileges, creating a bureaucracy where tribal loyalty once ruled. Trade brought wealth, but also curiosity. The courtiers of Ctesiphon began to collect objects from distant lands, lacquered boxes from China, ivory from India, amphorae stamped with Roman seals. Music followed the merchants. The flutes of the East mingled with the lutes of Babylon. In the temples, new gods appeared beside old ones. In the markets, foreign tongues wove into the speech of Parthia. The empire was becoming a crossroads, a living dialogue between civilizations. Mithridates used diplomacy as deftly as he wielded the bow. He sent envoys to Rome, offering goodwill and recognition of mutual borders, hoping to fix the Euphrates as the dividing line between East and West. At the same time, he extended influence northward into Armenia and the Caucasus. The kings there, weakened by internecine struggles, accepted his protection. Tribute flowed from their mountain fortresses into Parthian treasuries, a sign that the empire's reach had returned to the scale of its founder's dream. Under his rule, Ctesiphon grew into a true capital. The city's position, just across from Hellenistic Seleucia, symbolized Parthia's dual nature, Greek sophistication mirrored by Iranian strength. Palaces rose beside gardens watered by the Tigris, and the royal court became a theater of ceremony. Nobles arrived draped in embroidered cloaks, leading horses adorned with silver bridles. Foreign envoys waited in courtyards perfumed with incense, greeted by interpreters who spoke a dozen tongues. Yet behind all this splendor, the king remained the steady center, his authority grounded not in extravagance but in patience. He also reformed the military. The old balance of cavalry and archery was preserved, but the cataphracts, heavily armored riders once used sporadically, became a standing elite force. Their scale armor glittered like fish scales under the sun, and their discipline turned Parthian cavalry into an instrument of awe. The reforms reached beyond weapons. Officers were drawn from loyal noble houses, binding the military to the throne as securely as the councils had been. Religion, under Mithridates, continued to serve as the glue of identity. Zoroastrian fire temples were restored, and royal patronage funded the rebuilding of sanctuaries destroyed during the earlier invasions. Yet the king also maintained the tolerance his predecessors had shown. In Babylon, Jewish communities thrived under royal protection. In the Greek cities, temples to Apollo and Artemis still stood unmolested. Diversity was not weakness, it was policy. The prosperity of these decades transformed Parthia's image across the ancient world. To the west, Roman writers spoke of its gold and the mystery of its horsemen. To the east, Chinese envoys described it as the gateway to lands of marble and sea. Parthian merchants, once viewed as frontier traders, now carried diplomatic authority. They negotiated treaties as readily as they weighed silk. For the first time, the Arsacid court began to shape its own mythology. Bards sang of the founder Arsaces, of the wisdom of Tiridates, and of the conquests of Mithridates the Great. In their verses, Parthia was not merely an empire, it was a lineage, a covenant between land and rider, fire and sky. The nobility encouraged these tales, knowing that story could accomplish what sword alone could not: permanence. Yet even in the midst of abundance, danger flickered. The same nobles who served as pillars of stability also remembered their ancient autonomy. Their estates stretched across provinces, their private armies growing bold. Mithridates managed them through diplomacy and calculated generosity, but he knew that one weak successor could undo all he had built. Still, he trusted time. His empire, now connected by road, coin, and faith, had the resilience his predecessors had lacked. When his reign neared its end, Parthia stood taller than ever before. Its borders reached from the Oxus to the Euphrates. Its merchants commanded the wealth of continents. Its kings conversed with Rome as equals. The dream of Cyrus had found a new heir. On a spring morning, as legend tells, Mithridates rode along the banks of the Tigris, watching barges heavy with silk and wine drift beneath the bridges of Ctesiphon. He had outlived rebellion and defeat, turned isolation into empire, and bridged the farthest worlds known to man. As the river carried its quiet song to the sea, he saw in it the reflection of his kingdom, broad, fluid, enduring. Parthia had become the meeting place of East and West, and for the first time since the fall of Persia, the center of the world had returned to the Iranian plain. Time moved on, yet the brilliance of Mithridates II's reign refused to fade completely. For a while, the empire moved on the momentum of his achievements, its treasuries full, its frontiers quiet, its merchants still threading the Silk Road from Syria to the Oxus. But beneath that polished surface, cracks widened. The king had died without naming a clear heir, and in Parthia, inheritance was never a matter of blood alone. Power was a negotiation among nobles, a bargain struck and broken behind curtained halls. When the council of great families gathered to choose his successor, unity dissolved into rivalry. Brothers, cousins, and claimants from distant branches of the Arsacid line each raised their standards, declaring themselves chosen by fate. Civil war did not come as thunder. It crept like fog, settling first over the cities, then the plains. For years, Parthia was not one empire, but several, each ruled by a man who called himself king. In the west, Phraates III eventually emerged as the most formidable among them. He was shrewd, patient, and ruthless when he needed to be. Yet even as he restored order, he understood that he ruled by consent, not command. The nobles who had fought for him expected reward. Those who had fought against him demanded reconciliation. To keep the peace, Phraates gave both. He granted estates, confirmed ancient privileges, and seated old enemies beside new allies in his council. Outwardly, the empire breathed again, but the scent of division lingered like smoke. The weakening of royal authority transformed Parthia's political fabric. What had been a monarchy, wrapped in ceremony, began to resemble a confederation of warlords. Each noble clan governed its own region, almost as a kingdom. raising troops, collecting taxes, and enforcing local law. The Suren, the Karen, the Mihran all grew powerful enough to challenge the throne if provoked. The king's word, once law across 2 continents, now carried as far as his messengers could ride. Complicating matters further was the Parthian custom of lateral succession. Instead of the crown passing neatly from father to son, it could move sideways to a brother, an uncle, or even a cousin, if the nobles judged him worthier. This tanistry, ancient and pragmatic, avoided child kings but invited endless dispute. Every coronation risked becoming a civil war. In the quiet rooms of Nisa and Ctesiphon, intrigue became the empire's hidden language. While Parthia fought itself, the world beyond its borders shifted. To the west, Rome had finished conquering the Mediterranean and was now turning its gaze eastward. Pompey's legions entered Syria, claiming the territory once ruled by the Seleucids. Armenia, long a Parthian ally and sometimes a rival, wavered between submission to Rome and allegiance to the Arsacids. The Euphrates, once a distant frontier, became a contested line. Phraates III found himself a mediator between greater powers, between Tigranes of Armenia and Mithridates of Pontus, between Roman ambition and Eastern tradition. He played the game with skill, offering friendship to both sides while committing to neither. Envoys from Rome arrived in his court bearing gifts and promises. The Parthian answered with polite neutrality, keeping his armies close but his intentions closer. The delicate balance could not last. Nobles chafed at the king's caution, accusing him of cowardice. Younger princes urged a more aggressive policy, arguing that the loss of Armenia had broken the empire's prestige. Yet Phraates knew that open war with Rome would be ruin. His instinct was to wait, to let his enemies overextend themselves as they always had. Meanwhile, the internal machinery of governance began to decay. Tax collectors, once accountable to royal inspectors, grew corrupt. The flow of coin along the Silk Road slowed as regional lords imposed their own tolls. Cities that had flourished under the central administration became pawns in local rivalries. In Babylon, the temples still recorded the names of kings, but the scribes no longer knew which claimant truly ruled them. Despite these fractures, Parthian culture continued to blossom. The courts of noble families became centers of patronage, sponsoring poets, philosophers, and artisans. From these estates came a distinct Parthian style: bronze sculptures with almond eyes and square beards, murals depicting hunting scenes where kings and spirits mingled in dust and color. The fusion of Iranian symbolism and Greek form deepened, reflecting a civilization that thrived even as its politics faltered. Phraates himself maintained a veneer of grandeur. At Ctesiphon, he presided over festivals honoring Mithra, attended by ambassadors from as far as Bactria and Judea. The processions dazzled with gold and silk, but the king's face grew lined with worry. He could not ignore that each noble's loyalty depended on the promise of favor. The court whispered of plots, some real, some imagined. Before long, suspicion turned lethal. One winter evening, the palace erupted in violence. Accounts differ. Some say Phraates was slain by one of his sons. Others that conspirators among the aristocracy orchestrated the murder. Whatever the truth, his death was swift, and the nobles proclaimed a successor before dawn. The cycle of instability had begun anew. Beyond the palace walls, the common people endured as they always had. Farmers tilled the fields, merchants haggled in the bazaars, priests tended the sacred fires. To them, kings changed as often as seasons, but Parthia remained. Their empire was not its rulers, but the land itself. When Rome's envoys next crossed the Euphrates, they found an empire weary but still formidable. Parthian horsemen patrolled the deserts, their armor glinting in the sun, their discipline unbroken. The nobles might squabble, but the army that had humbled the Seleucids still rode in defense of their realm. To the Romans, it was a paradox. A kingdom divided yet dangerous, ancient yet unpredictable. By the late 60s BCE, as civil war consumed Armenia and Rome extended its shadow into the Near East, Parthia stood at a crossroads. Some in the royal court urged alliance with Pompey, others counseled war. The debate ended with neither. The empire turned inward again, its energies swallowed by succession struggles that seemed endless. Still, amid the unrest, a truth endured. The Parthian world was too vast, too entangled in trade and tradition, to collapse easily. Even in weakness, it adapted. The nobles who undermined the throne also protected it, for their fortunes depended on its survival. Parthia had entered a darker age, but not yet its twilight. As the decade closed, a new power stirred on the western horizon. Rome, victorious in its civil wars, sought to test the strength of the eastern kingdoms. In 53 BC, a Roman triumvir named Crassus would march toward the Euphrates, bringing with him an army confident of easy triumph. None yet knew that his ambition would meet its end in the deserts of Mesopotamia, and that from that clash, Parthia's name would echo through history once more. By the middle of the 1st century BC, Parthia stood poised between resurgence and danger. Its kings had survived a century of upheaval. Its nobles had grown accustomed to ruling beside the throne, and its horsemen still commanded fear across Asia. Yet far beyond the Euphrates, a new empire had risen, a republic that called itself eternal, whose generals spoke of world dominion as though it were destiny. Rome's gaze, once fixed on the Mediterranean, now turned east. The collision was not inevitable, but it was invited. Trade had already bound the two powers long before their armies met. Roman silver poured eastward to pay for silk and spices, while Parthian merchants filled their coffers with coins stamped with unfamiliar Latin names. Both profited, both distrusted. The Euphrates became less a river than a mirror, each side seeing in the other a rival reflection. When Marcus Licinius Crassus marched into Syria as governor in 54 BC, he sought more than administration. He craved the glory that had eluded him in Rome's civil wars, and Parthia offered a stage large enough to redeem his pride. Reports from the frontier described an empire divided, weakened by noble factions, ripe for conquest. His advisors promised him an easy campaign, a swift strike across the desert, a victory to rival Caesars in Gaul or Pompey's in the east. On the Parthian side, Orodes II had recently seized the throne after years of intrigue. He ruled through a mixture of caution and delegation, and at his right hand stood Surena, the general whose name would be remembered long after kings were forgotten. Head of the Suren clan, Surena was young, immensely wealthy, and proud of his lineage. He had crowned Orodes with his own hands, as custom demanded, and in return had been granted command of the empire's western army. His loyalty was bound not by oath, but by reputation. While Crassus assembled his legions in Syria, Parthian scouts shadowed them from afar. The Roman plan was bold but ill-informed. Guided by Armenian allies, eager to see Parthia humbled, Crassus rejected safer northern routes and chose instead the direct march through Mesopotamia, an endless expanse of sun, sand, and silence. He expected to find a provincial army, perhaps a scattering of bowmen. What awaited him was a force designed precisely for the kind of battle Rome could not win. Surena gathered his cavalry at Kari, an ancient city crouched among salt plains. His host numbered perhaps 10,000, light horse archers and armored cataphracts, their armor polished to a dull silver. He brought with him 1,000 camels, laden not with provisions but with arrows, ensuring that his riders would never need to halt their fire. Each bow was a masterpiece of composite horn and sinew, capable of piercing armor at impossible range. When the Romans advanced into the open desert, Surena held his troops back, letting heat and distance do their work. Dust rose from the marching columns until the legions moved as shadows behind their own haze. Then came the sound, an unearthly thunder of hooves and drums. Parthian cavalry appeared on the horizon, encircling them in widening rings. Trumpets blared, arrows fell like rain. The Roman formation, a wall of shields and discipline, found itself facing an enemy that would not close for combat. Each charge ended in feigned retreat. Each pursuit drew them deeper into the killing ground. The Parthian shot, a maneuver perfected over generations, turned the retreat into attack. Riders twisted backward in their saddles, releasing volleys while galloping away. The legions, sweating beneath the sun, could neither advance nor withdraw. Hour after hour, the arrows fell. Crassus ordered his cavalry forward. They vanished in moments, consumed by dust and confusion. Camels moved among the Parthians, supplying fresh quivers. When the Romans tried to rest, Surena unleashed his cataphracts. Men encased in iron, horses armored from muzzle to tail, wielding the contos, a lance longer than any Roman pike. They struck like a wave of metal, withdrew, and struck again. By nightfall, the field was a ruin of shields and broken standards. Crassus, desperate to rally his men, sought parley, but deception followed him to the end. Invited to negotiate, he was seized and slain, his head carried east to the court of Orodes. There, as actors performed a Greek tragedy for the king, the severed head was brought in place of a prop, a gesture as cruel as it was theatrical. The defeat at Carrhae shattered more than an army. It humiliated the greatest power of the Mediterranean and gave Parthia a legend. Rome had met a force that fought without walls, without cities, and yet with precision greater than any legion. The desert, once dismissed as emptiness, had become a weapon. In the aftermath, Surena's triumph was celebrated in Babylon with all the splendor the East could muster. Prisoners were paraded through the streets. Trophies of Roman standards hung beside the temples. For the Parthians, it was a vindication, a proof that their way of war, born of motion and discipline, could withstand even the mightiest empire of the West. But victory carried its own peril. Orodes, uneasy with his general's fame, soon ordered Surena's death, fearing he might eclipse the throne he had served. Thus the hero of Carrhae vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind a memory that outlived his kings. Rome reeled, but did not forget. In its forums, the loss was recast as tragedy and warning. Poets spoke of the Eastern horsemen as phantoms of the desert. Senators demanded vengeance. Yet years would pass before another Roman dared to cross the Euphrates. Parthia's triumph bought it breathing space, not peace. For the empire itself, Kari was a revelation. The battle confirmed that Parthia's strength lay not in numbers or fortresses, but in adaptability. Its cavalry had turned the openness of its land into strategy, its mobility into art. From that day onward, the shadow of Surena's tactics would ride beside every army that challenged the east. As the sun set over the blood-soaked plain, carrion birds wheeled above the wreckage of legions, and the wind buried shields beneath sand. The field of Carrhae became a legend, a reminder that even the mightiest empire could falter where arrogance met endurance. From the ruins of that day rose a new confidence, fragile but fierce. For a brief moment in history, Parthia had humbled Rome, and the desert itself seemed to whisper that the balance of the world had shifted eastward. The victory at Cari echoed through the courts of East and West alike. In Rome, it was spoken of with grief and disbelief. In Parthia, with pride that shaded into peril. Success had elevated Orodes II, but it had also unsettled the fragile balance that held his kingdom together. Triumph in the desert did not guarantee peace at home. Behind the celebration, ambition began to stir among generals, princes, and satraps who had tasted what glory against Rome could bring. Orodes ruled with a calculating calm, yet even he could not command loyalty without suspicion. The nobles, restless after Surena's execution, whispered of his ingratitude. His son Pacorus, young and charismatic, quickly became the focus of their admiration. The prince had ridden in his father's campaigns and carried himself with the same confidence that had made the old heroes legendary. Crowds in Seleucia cheered him openly. Bards sang his name beside those of Arsaces and Mithridates. A dynasty built on conquest was now threatened by its own success. Beyond the palace walls, Rome's chaos spilled eastward. The Republic had fractured into civil war. Pompey against Caesar, senators against generals, brothers against brothers. Each faction sought allies wherever they could be found. Envoys from Syria arrived in Ctesiphon bearing gifts, promising recognition if Parthia would intervene. Orodes listened but waited. He knew that Rome destroyed its friends as easily as its enemies. For now, neutrality seemed safer than favor. That caution would not last. In 42 BC, after Caesar's murder, the assassins Brutus and Cassius fled east, rallying the remnants of their armies. They appealed to Parthia for support, offering gold and friendship in exchange for soldiers. Orodes agreed to lend them cavalry and archers, thinking to weaken Rome without risking his own heartlands. For a brief moment, Parthian banners rode beside Roman standards on the plains of Asia Minor, a strange alliance born of mutual necessity. But fortune favored Antony and Octavian. When Brutus and Cassius fell at Philippi, the victors turned their eyes toward Parthia. Orodes' position grew precarious. The death of his allies had left him isolated, and the nobles began urging preemptive action. Among them, Pacorus saw opportunity. With the encouragement of a Roman renegade, Quintus Labienus, once loyal to Pompey, he gathered an army to strike first. Together, they crossed the Euphrates in 40 BC, sweeping through Syria with astonishing speed. Cities that had trembled before Crassus now opened their gates willingly. The Parthians entered Antioch in triumph, and for the first time, the Roman East lay under Eastern rule. The campaign might have remade the world had it lasted. Pacorus advanced deep into Asia Minor, establishing garrisons and appointing governors. Yet conquest is heavier to hold than to gain. Supply lines thinned, discipline eroded. Some cities rebelled as swiftly as they had submitted. Worse still, the Romans regrouped. Mark Antony's lieutenants raised fresh legions in the west, and by 38 BC, they were marching eastward in vengeance. On the banks of the Euphrates, near the hills of Gindarus, the two forces met. Pacorus commanded from horseback, his armor gilded, his standard crowned with the image of a winged sun. The Romans fought with grim determination, remembering Cari. The battle turned on a single charge. Parthian horsemen, lured into pursuit, were caught between advancing cohorts and slaughtered in the narrow valley. Pacorus fell amid his guard, pierced by a Roman spear. His death broke the formation. The survivors fled back across the river. News of the defeat reached Ctesiphon on a day heavy with dust. Orodes, devastated by the loss of his son, withdrew from court, leaving the empire adrift. His grief turned inward, curdling into paranoia. One by one, courtiers who reminded him of Pacorus were dismissed or executed. Within a year, he himself was dead. Murdered, some said, by another son eager for the crown. The empire he had inherited from Mithridates now descended into confusion. In the vacuum that followed, the Arsacid succession became a labyrinth of betrayal. Phraates IV seized the throne through blood and cunning, eliminating rivals before they could speak against him. He executed his brothers, silenced the noble council, and ruled from behind guarded doors. To secure his power, he turned to foreign mercenaries and eunuch advisors, an affront to the old aristocracy. Those who had once shared the king's table now fled into exile or rebellion. Civil strife followed like thunder after lightning. From Babylon to Hyrcania, pretenders rose proclaiming themselves rightful heirs. Phraates answered with terror. Coins from his early reign bear a youthful face, serene and untroubled. Those from his later years show eyes rimmed with exhaustion. His cruelty may have bought survival, but it cost him legitimacy. The empire's foundations, nobility, faith, and tradition, strained beneath the weight of his fear. Meanwhile, Rome, weary of its own turmoil, turned diplomacy into its weapon. Mark Antony sent envoys offering peace in exchange for the return of captured standards and prisoners from Cari. Phraates, shrewd despite his paranoia, agreed. He had no wish to provoke another invasion, while his own throne smoldered. Thus began a cautious thaw between two empires that had bled each other for decades. The Euphrates once again became their boundary, its shifting waters marking the line between ambition and restraint. In the east, smaller kingdoms watched and waited. Characene, a trading state at the head of the Persian Gulf, used Parthia's weakness to assert near independence. Its ports bustled with ships carrying pearls, spices, and incense, their taxes enriching local kings who paid only nominal tribute. Such states revealed both the strength and the flaw of Arsacid rule, flexibility that allowed survival and decentralization that invited defiance. By the late 30s BC, Parthia had endured a generation of triumphs and tragedies that would have destroyed lesser empires. It had faced Rome in battle and survived. It had turned internal chaos into endurance, yet the scars ran deep. The nobility had learned that a king could be overthrown, and the throne had learned that fear was its only defense. Still, the idea of Parthia, the kingdom of horsemen and kings, the bridge between worlds, remained unbroken. Even in the darkest years, caravans crossed its deserts, temples burned their eternal fires, and scribes in Nisa recorded the names of rulers with the same solemnity as before. The empire had lost its golden age, but not its pulse. When the Euphrates ran low in the summer heat, travelers could still see the remnants of battle along its banks. Broken spearheads, scraps of armor, traces of old camps now half buried in sand. To those who passed, they were more than relics. They were warnings. Power in the east, like the desert wind, could never be held for long. And as Rome's legions rebuilt their strength across the river, the world waited for the next storm. When the storms of civil war finally quieted in the west, a single name rose from the wreckage. Augustus, master of Rome, restorer of its peace. Across the deserts of Mesopotamia, his fame arrived long before his envoys. To the Parthians, who had seen Roman armies burn and break in their sands, the new emperor was not a man, but a question. Would peace follow his crown or another invasion? Phraates IV, wary and aging, ruled from Ctesiphon in uneasy solitude. The blood he had spilled to win the throne still haunted him, and the nobles watched with patient hatred. His reign was strong but brittle, sustained by fear and the advantage of geography. Yet even he understood that time had shifted. The Romans no longer fought for survival. They fought for order, and order had a long reach. Trade between the two empires had never ceased. Caravans still rolled through the gates of Seleucia, their camels heavy with silk and glass, their drivers carrying Roman coins alongside Parthian drachms. But beneath that exchange flowed an unspoken rivalry. Rome wanted recognition of its supremacy. Parthia demanded acknowledgement of its equality. Each pretended not to need the other, yet each was drawn toward negotiation by profit and pride alike. The first contact came quietly. Augustus sent envoys to Parthia, bearing gifts and a message of reconciliation. The Roman standard, the eagle lost at Cari, had become a symbol of humiliation. Its return would turn defeat into closure, shame into diplomacy. Phraates, advised by courtiers who saw advantage in peace, agreed to meet. The scene, recorded by later historians with theatrical detail, took place on the Euphrates itself, halfway between the two worlds. On a wooden platform moored to the riverbank, Roman and Parthian envoys stood beneath twin banners. The Parthians brought the captured eagles, their bronze wings dulled by years of sand. The Romans offered hostages and gifts. For the first time in living memory, the frontier did not echo with the clash of arms, but with the murmur of voices seeking accord. The treaty that followed was not conquest and not submission. Augustus called it victory. Phraates called it balance. Each empire saw in the agreement what it wished to see. The Euphrates was declared a line of mutual respect. Armenia, long the fulcrum of their rivalry, would remain independent, its throne shared in influence between them. The lost standards returned to Rome, and Augustus displayed them in his new temple of Mars the Avenger, turning diplomacy into spectacle. For Parthia, the gesture cost nothing and gained prestige. To the outside world, it was clear that the heirs of Alexander and the masters of Rome now faced one another as equals. Within Parthia, the king's decision bought him time, but not trust. His paranoia deepened. He feared plots from every side, even within his own household. When an Italian concubine, Musa, bore him a son, he believed it an omen. She soon rose from captive to queen, her influence as subtle as it was absolute. Through her mediation, Parthia and Rome maintained their fragile peace, exchanging hostages and gifts. Among those hostages were the king's elder sons, sent westward to ensure good faith. To Roman chroniclers, this proved Augustus's triumph. To Parthian scribes, it showed the prudence of their monarch. Truth lay somewhere between. In the cities of Mesopotamia, peace changed the rhythm of life. Seleucia thrived again, its marketplaces crowded with Greek merchants and Persian traders. Across the river, Ctesiphon expanded into a metropolis, its palaces rising on terraces of pale stone. The twin cities mirrored the empire itself, one outward-looking and cosmopolitan, the other steeped in Iranian tradition. Their rivalry was constant yet productive, each spurring the other toward greater splendor. Commerce now moved with unprecedented speed. From Antioch to Merv, way stations provided rest for caravans bearing silk, lapis, ivory, and glass. The customs houses of Parthia recorded tolls in 2 languages, Greek for the cities, Aramaic for the frontier, Persian for the royal court. The empire had turned trade into governance. Wealth from distant lands funded temples, roads, and the royal army. In this prosperity, Parthia found its own version of empire, a dominion not of direct rule, but of influence that stretched as far as its merchants could travel. Among the scholars of Babylon, this age of calm was seen as a turning of the heavens. Their astronomical diaries, which once chronicled omens of war, now spoke of abundance and peace. The kings of the West and the East, one tablet reads, have set aside the sword. The river divides, yet unites them to the priests of fire. Such harmony was not merely political, it was cosmic, a moment when truth and order balanced across nations. Yet harmony is never permanent. Freytag's domestic troubles grew until they eclipsed his diplomacy. Musa, once his companion in peace, became the architect of his downfall. Desiring the throne for her son, she persuaded the king to send his older heirs to Rome as guests, a decision that stripped him of protection. Soon after, Phraates was poisoned, his death quiet and efficient. Musa's son, Phraates V, was proclaimed king, with his mother ruling beside him. Roman historians would later cast her as a seductress, Parthian sources as an ambitious queen. Either way, she was a woman who had understood that influence often achieved what armies could not. The new monarchs maintained the peace with Rome, though distrust lingered beneath the courtesy. Their reign was short and scandalous. Whispers of incest and sacrilege spread through the court, and the nobles, already weary of royal excess, rose in revolt. Both mother and son were overthrown, their fates swallowed by the desert. Once again, the throne was vacant, and once again, the nobles assembled to choose a ruler. Through these convulsions, the peace endured. Rome, now secure under Augustus, had no need to provoke the East, and Parthia, divided but prosperous, preferred trade to war. The frontier hardened into custom, legions on one bank, horsemen on the other, each watching, each waiting. The balance that had begun at the Euphrates raft became the unspoken law of the ancient world. During these decades, the fusion of cultures deepened. Greek sculptors carved images of Iranian kings. Babylonian scribes recorded royal decrees in Greek script. Merchants in Ctesiphon counted their profits in Roman coin. In palaces and markets alike, Parthia became the meeting point of civilizations. Its scholars translated Greek philosophy into Aramaic. Its artisans borrowed Roman glass-making techniques, and its priests adapted older Persian rites to new audiences. A civilization that had once defined itself by resistance now thrived on exchange. When Augustus died in 14 AD, the Parthian court sent formal condolences, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The message reached Rome by caravan rather than by messenger, wrapped in silk and sealed with gold. To the Romans, it was courtesy. To the Parthians, it was assertion. We endure, as you do. For the first time since the days of Cyrus, the lands between the Tigris and the Oxus enjoyed an unbroken generation of stability. Roads were safe, temples rich, and kings, however transient, ruled beneath the illusion of divine favor. The empire had discovered a truth as old as its mountains, that survival was not always won by conquest, but sometimes by restraint. When twilight fell over the Euphrates and the wind rippled its surface, soldiers on opposite banks could see one another's fires reflected in the current. Neither side advanced, neither retreated. Between them flowed the boundary of their worlds, peaceful, fragile, luminous in the dying light. The peace that Augustus had brokered did not erase Parthia's restlessness. It merely dulled its edges. Beneath the calm surface of the Euphrates frontier, ambition continued to stir in Ctesiphon. The Arsacid kings, caught between noble councils and royal bloodlines, struggled to govern a realm that never fully belonged to them. Power in Parthia was fluid, part inheritance, part consent, and every new reign began as both coronation and contest. After the death of Phraates V, a series of short-lived monarchs passed through the throne like shadows. Each was raised by factions of the nobility. Each fell when that support shifted. In the western provinces, Greek cities wavered between loyalty and rebellion. In the east, Hyrcania and Margiana grew semi-independent, their governors ruling in all but name. The court at Ctesiphon glittered with wealth, yet the air was thick with intrigue. By mid-century, stability returned under Vologases I, a ruler who combined patience with purpose. He ascended the throne around 51 AD, inheriting an empire frayed by decades of uncertainty. Where his predecessors had relied on the sword, he preferred persuasion. His first acts were symbolic but profound. He founded a new royal city, Vologasius, near Ctesiphon, and ordered the collection of Zoroastrian texts scattered during years of turmoil. Fire temples were rebuilt, their flames rekindled from sacred embers kept hidden through the wars. The king spoke of divine order restored, a harmony between heaven's law and the empire's will. Still, no peace in Parthia was without rivalry. The nobles remained powerful, their families entrenched in estates that stretched from Media to the Persian Gulf. Each saw himself as custodian of tradition and potential kingmaker. The Suren clan, once led by the legendary Surena, retained immense prestige. The Karen ruled the mountain passes. The Mihran commanded armies along the Caspian shores. Vologases courted them all, offering honors in exchange for loyalty. He understood that unity in Parthia was not enforced. It was negotiated. To the west, the Romans, under Emperor Nero, were once again watching the borderlands. Armenia, that perpetual hinge between empires, had become the stage of a renewed contest. When Vologases placed his brother Tiridates on the Armenian throne, Rome saw it as provocation. Nero dispatched the general Corbulo to reclaim influence, and for 6 years, the mountains of Armenia burned. The Parthians excelled in open plains, but found little advantage among peaks and snow. Cities changed hands, armies starved, and both sides bled without victory. In 63 AD, exhaustion forced diplomacy where strategy had failed. The Treaty of Rhandaea ended the stalemate. Tiridates would remain king of Armenia, but travel to Rome to receive his crown from Nero himself. The ceremony was theatre as much as politics, an Armenian monarch kneeling before a Roman emperor to receive a diadem he already wore. Yet for Parthia, it was triumph disguised as concession. Tiridates ruled Armenia thereafter as a loyal brother of Vologases, and the peace secured the empire's western frontier for a generation. At home, Vologases cultivated an image of renewal. He issued coinage inscribed in both Greek and Aramaic, a declaration that the empire's cultures could coexist. Scholars gathered at his court to record the Avesta, preserving the scriptures of the old Persian faith. The revival was not purely religious, it was political. By aligning himself with the sacred fire, the king bound his authority to something older than dynasties. Even those who doubted his power could not question his piety. Still, beneath the surface, old rivalries persisted. Hyrcania, long unruly, resisted the central government. Its satraps defied royal tax collectors and raised their own armies. In the Far East, the vassal kings of Margiana tested the limits of autonomy. Vologases' forces marched and countermarched through the borderlands, never quite crushing rebellion, never quite losing control. Parthia's strength lay not in absolute order, but in its capacity to absorb disorder without collapse. At the royal court, succession remained an open wound. The sons of Vologases eyed one another across banquets and festivals, each gathering supporters among the nobility. Two figures stood out, Vardanes and Gutases. Their rivalry erupted into open conflict even before their father's death. Armies of nobles clashed across Mesopotamia. Cities changed allegiance overnight, and the road from Nisa to Babylon was lined with burned estates. Chroniclers describe years when the crown passed from one brother to the other as easily as a torch. Amid the chaos the empire endured, the nobility, though divided, never invited foreign conquest. Their quarrels were domestic rituals, destructive yet contained. Roman observers, baffled by this resilience, mistook it for weakness. They failed to see that the Arsacid system, for all its anarchy, was self-sustaining. The throne might wobble, but the pillars, trade, aristocracy, faith, remained unbroken. Even the eastern provinces, weary of constant warfare, found their own rhythm. Caravan routes continued to hum with commerce. From India came pepper and ivory. From China, bolts of silk. From Syria, glass and wine. Parthia's governors learned to profit from the peace between battles. The Silk Road, that great artery of the ancient world, pulsed steadily through turmoil. By the 70s AD, Vologases I was aging, but his empire had regained confidence. His diplomacy with Rome had secured the West. His reforms had revived the East. Though the nobles still plotted and provinces still tested the crown, Parthia stood whole once more. In the bazaars of Ctesiphon, merchants spoke of prosperity. In the temples, priests prayed for the king's long life. He died around 78 AD, leaving behind not a realm without problems, but one with renewed identity. His successors would inherit the same challenges: nobles too strong, borders too wide. But they would also inherit an idea that Parthia could outlast its crises through balance rather than conquest. In the years that followed, travelers from Rome described a kingdom at once alien and familiar. Fire altars flickering beside Greek colonnades, nobles who quoted Homer yet swore oaths to Ahura Mazda, soldiers who rode like wind but worshipped like priests. It was a world shaped by contradictions, sustained by equilibrium. And as night fell over the twin cities of the Tigris, the fires of Ctesiphon and Seleucia glowed like twin stars reflected on the river, two halves of one restless empire, bound together by faith, trade, and the enduring will to survive. When Vologases I was laid to rest, Parthia stood at the height of its recovery, rich, vast, and self-assured. Yet history rarely allows long peace on the borders of great empires. Beyond the Euphrates, a new generation of Roman emperors viewed the East not as a distant neighbor, but as a prize. The balance Augustus had crafted, the diplomacy of Vologases, began to tremble. The frontier that once divided equals would soon divide conquerors and defenders. The first sparks came from Armenia, that old hinge of the world. Rome, under the Flavian emperors, sought to tighten control over its vassal kings, and Parthia resisted. Each side claimed to protect Armenian independence while seeking to possess it. Local princes learned to survive by duplicity, pledging allegiance to whichever empire sent the most soldiers. Parthian envoys demanded recognition of their brother kings. Roman legions replied with fortresses and roads. The cold peace frayed, thread by thread. When the throne passed to Osroes I, He inherited both grandeur and fragility. His realm stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Caucasus, yet it was no longer a single will. Noble families acted as semi-independent dynasts, each guarding their provinces like private kingdoms. Even within the royal house, claimants multiplied. In the west, his rival Vologases III ruled as co-king, an arrangement that satisfied no one and confused everyone. To foreign observers, it seemed the empire was ruled by a family feud. To the Parthians, it was simply continuity by conflict. In 113 AD, Rome's emperor Trajan crossed the frontier. He was no opportunist, but an architect of empire, determined to remake the East in Rome's image. His legions advanced methodically, conquering Armenia in weeks and pressing down the Tigris. City after city fell: Edessa, Nisibis, Dura. The Euphrates line that had stood for a century dissolved in dust. The campaign was swift, brilliant, and ruthless. When Trajan entered Babylon, he performed sacrifices to the gods of Alexander, as if completing the unfinished work of the Macedonian conqueror. The following year, his banners reached Ctesiphon itself. The twin capitals of Seleucia and Ctesiphon, long symbols of Parthian endurance, were captured and plundered. In triumph, the Roman emperor declared Mesopotamia a new province of the empire. For a brief, improbable moment, Rome ruled from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf. Yet what is taken swiftly is rarely held long. The farther Rome advanced, the more it found itself at war with the land itself. The deserts swallowed supply lines, cities rose in revolt, and the Parthian nobles rallied behind Osroes. Bands of horsemen cut Roman columns to pieces, harassing them day after day until the legions began their slow, bitter retreat. Trajan's victories turned to burdens, his triumphs to questions. He died on his way home, leaving behind an empire overextended and exhausted. His successor, Hadrian, reversed the tide. Realizing the futility of holding Mesopotamia, he withdrew the legions and restored the old frontier. The Euphrates once again marked the limit of Roman ambition. Officially, both powers spoke of friendship renewed. In truth, they had merely resumed a wary balance. The century that followed became a duel of endurance rather than conquest. Parthia, though battered, recovered swiftly. Seleucia rebuilt its markets, Ctesiphon reoccupied its palaces, and the noble families returned to their estates, stronger than before. Trade flowed again across the old caravan routes. The same roads that had carried armies now carried peace. Even so, the cost of survival was visible in the coinage. The tetradrachms struck during these years show the decline of royal confidence. Their silver content debased, their inscriptions cramped, their portraits weary. Economists of later ages would see in this the sign of decay. In truth, it was adaptation. The nobles had learned to mint locally, feeding regional economies that made the empire resilient even when the center wavered. But the conflicts were not only military or economic, they were spiritual. The wars with Rome had awakened a hunger for identity. Across Iran, Zoroastrianism experienced a revival. Fire temples rose again in Media and Persis, their altars tended by priests who traced their lineage to the time before Alexander. The empire, weary of foreign influence, began to look inward for meaning. Kings once styled themselves in Greek on their coins. Now they added titles in the native tongue, invoking divine light and Iranian glory. The West still glittered, but Parthia's heart turned eastward, back toward its origins. Rome, meanwhile, was changing shape. After Trajan's death, new emperors rose: Hadrian, Antoninus, Marcus Aurelius, philosopher kings who admired Greek culture and sought peace more than conquest. Their embassies reached Ctesiphon, bearing gifts, letters, and flattery. But peace between rivals is never simple. Behind every embassy stood the suspicion that another invasion might come. That fear materialized again under Lucius Verus, co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius. In 161 AD, Parthia invaded Armenia once more, seeking to assert dominance after years of internal strife. Rome responded with overwhelming force. Legions marched through Cappadocia and crossed the Euphrates, capturing Seleucia and Ctesiphon again. Fire consumed the great cities. Plague followed the soldiers home. The Antonine Plague, carried west by the triumphant legions, would claim thousands across the Roman world, a grim testament to how intertwined the two empires had become. In Parthia, the invasion left scars deeper than the ruins. The nobility saw in the disaster proof that the monarchy could no longer shield them. Local rulers hardened their autonomy. Provincial coinage and militias flourished. The king's writ grew faint in the east, where the memory of independence was never forgotten. Still, Parthia did not collapse. Its resilience was astonishing. Within a decade, trade revived, temples reopened, and the fire altars of the highlands burned anew. Travelers along the Silk Road found the same familiar sequence of cities: Merv, Hekatompelos, Rege, each alive with commerce. For every city raised, another rose beside it. By the early 2nd century, observers from both Rome and China described Parthia as a paradox, fragile in its politics, unshakable in its existence. The empire's genius was not to dominate, but to endure. Its nobles had become masters of survival, its kings symbols rather than sovereigns, and yet together they maintained the illusion and the reality of unity. When Roman envoys crossed the frontier to renew trade pacts, they found the same ancient courtly rituals intact. Carpets woven in firelight, gold cups filled with date wine, courtiers who spoke Greek with one breath and Parthian with the next. The faces had changed, the names shifted, but the rhythm remained. By 130 AD, as the last echoes of the Roman campaigns faded, Parthia stood battered but alive, its cities rebuilt, its traditions deepened by adversity. The wars had taken their toll, yet they had also redefined what it meant to be Arsacid. The empire had outlived conquerors and calamities alike, proving that power need not be perfect to persist. Far to the west, the Romans celebrated peace on their marble altars. Far to the east, the Parthians lit their fires and watched the stars. Between them stretched the same river, the same desert, and the same unending tension, a fragile balance that neither side could live without. The victories of recovery faded quickly. By the middle of the 2nd century AD, the Arsacid Empire was no longer the tireless machine of horse and bow that had once defied the world. The grandeur of Mithridates the Great and Vologases the First survived in legend and architecture, not in governance. Beneath the sunlit courts of Ctesiphon, the crown had become an ornament, and behind the polished rituals of kingship, power shifted silently into other hands. The great noble houses, the Suren, the Karen, the Mihran, had transformed from supporters of the throne into its rivals. Each controlled vast estates, private armies, and hereditary satrapies that stretched across the Iranian plateau. Their fortresses dotted the mountains like small kingdoms, their banners flying beside the royal standard, but loyal only to themselves. The king's orders were obeyed when convenient, ignored when costly. Parthia had become less a realm than a confederation of aristocracies held together by habit and the memory of older triumphs. At court, the struggle for dominance played out through ceremony. The throne still gleamed with gold, and the fire altars still blazed in its shadow. But behind the smoke, politics had turned predatory. Councils of nobles debated succession as if casting lots. Coins minted in different provinces bore competing royal names: Vologases, Pacorus, Artabanus, each a claimant to legitimacy. In the west, one branch of the Arsacid family ruled from Ctesiphon. In the east, another reigned from Ecbatana, claiming the same titles. Even Parthia's chroniclers, ever loyal to continuity, began to lose count of their kings. Yet outwardly, life in the empire flourished. Caravans moved unimpeded along the Silk Road, carrying luxuries between Rome, India, and China. The flow of trade that once stitched the empire together had become its true foundation. Merchants built temples and endowed cities where kings could not. Karashin, at the head of the Persian Gulf, grew rich on maritime commerce, its ports thrumming with ships bound for Arabia and the Indus. Elymais, nestled in the Zagros Mountains, minted its own coins and maintained its own courts while still acknowledging Arsacid suzerainty. In their autonomy lay Parthia's paradox, weakness disguised as stability. When the Romans under Septimius Severus marched east in 195 AD, they faced not a united state, but a mosaic of powers. The emperor, eager for glory, advanced swiftly through Mesopotamia, taking advantage of local divisions. Babylon offered little resistance. Seleucia opened its gates in despair. Severus entered Ctesiphon with theatrical triumph, seizing its treasures and claiming the submission of the Parthian king. For a moment, it seemed as though Rome had finally broken the empire that had defied it for centuries. Yet when his legions withdrew, the desert reclaimed the roads, the nobles reclaimed the cities, and the illusion of conquest vanished like dust in the wind. Hatra alone defied him. The city stood as a marvel and a mystery, its high walls carved with faces of gods both Eastern and Greek, its temples adorned with reliefs of archers and lions. Twice Severus besieged it, and twice it held, its defenders raining arrows from the towers until the Roman machines fell silent. The survival of Hatra became legend, a symbol of Parthian resilience amid decay. Cultural life in these years was strangely vigorous. From Dura Europos on the Euphrates came archives of contracts, tax records, and marriage deeds, evidence of an administrative system that still functioned with precision despite political chaos. The city's murals show Parthian soldiers in their distinct armor, standing before gods painted in vibrant colors, Iranian fire symbols beside Hellenistic nymphs, Mesopotamian winged spirits sharing walls with Roman patterns. The empire's boundaries had blurred, yet its creativity had not. In the highlands, the art of Nisa continued to evolve. Sculptors carved figures with rigid frontality and deep-set eyes, a style that would echo centuries later in Persian and Central Asian art. At Takht-e Soleiman, fire temples rose again, their sanctuaries crowned with domes of mud brick and copper. Here, Zoroastrianism reasserted itself as the moral axis of empire. The priests spoke not of kings, but of cosmic struggle, light against darkness, order against chaos, a reflection, perhaps, of the realm itself. The nobles adopted the symbols of faith as armor for their ambitions. Each patronized fire temples, sponsored festivals, and claimed divine favor for his lineage. Religion, once a unifying force, became another field of rivalry. In the cities, Hellenized elites resisted this turn toward orthodoxy, clinging to Greek theater and sculpture. In the countryside, the priests denounced such foreign indulgence as corruption. The empire's soul, like its politics, was divided, and yet, for all its fractures, Parthia endured. Its roads remained safe, Its language, the Parthian script written in bold, looping letters, spread through contracts and poetry alike. Its art blended the worlds it had inherited, the realism of Greece, the mysticism of Iran, the monumentality of Mesopotamia. Travelers from far lands saw decline. Those within saw continuity. The Arsacids had learned to survive not by dominance, but by diffusion. Still, rumors of a new power began to drift northward from Persis. In the shadowed valleys around Istakur, a local dynasty was gathering strength. Their ruler, Pabag, claimed descent from the ancient kings of Persia and spoke openly of restoring the glory of the Achaemenids. His son, Ardashir, was said to be bold, disciplined, and possessed of an ambition sharper than any sword. To the weary nobles of Parthia, such men seemed distant curiosities. To the priests, they whispered promise. By 180 AD, the Arsacid world was weary but unbroken. The Surans still led armies, the merchants still prospered, the temples still burned. Yet the harmony between them, kings, nobles, faith, had grown brittle. Each pillar stood tall, but none leaned toward the other. The empire had become an echo chamber of its own legends, great enough to remember but too divided to act. At sunset, the twin capitals along the Tigris shimmered beneath the gold light of the dying day. Barges drifted on the river, their sails glowing like embers. The hum of trade, the chant of priests, the clatter of hooves, all continued, unaware that a new age was already approaching. Parthia, proud and weary, still stood upon the world's stage, but the curtain was beginning to stir. By the close of the 2nd century AD, the Arsacid Empire had the appearance of endurance but the heart of exhaustion. From the Caspian to the Gulf, palaces gleamed and temples burned their sacred fires. Yet the unity that had once held the empire together had thinned to ceremony. The nobility ruled their domains like small monarchs. The kings in Ctesiphon, more priests of legitimacy than masters of policy, reigned in name while others governed in deed. Parthia's greatest strength, its loose confederation of powers, had become its most fatal flaw. When Vologases IV ascended the throne around 191 AD, he inherited not an empire to command, but one to balance. His authority rested on diplomacy, his reign upon patience. He appeased the great houses with titles and marriages, promising stability in exchange for loyalty. Yet the cracks were widening. The fire temples of Persis and Media had grown wealthy, their priests wielding influence equal to generals. Governors in Elymais and Characine minted their own coins, their independence disguised by ritual homage to the Arsacid name. What had once been an empire of riders was now an empire of negotiations. In the far south, a spark caught flame. In the rugged hills of Persis, a vassal named Pabag rose in quiet rebellion. His lineage was obscure, one of many local dynasts who paid tribute to the Arsacid kings, but his ambition reached beyond his valley. Claiming descent from the ancient Achaemenids, Pabag revived the old Persian symbols of kingship, the winged crown, the fire altar, and the divine aura that bound ruler and cosmos. To the weary subjects of a distant and divided empire, his message was intoxicating. His son Ardashir inherited more than the dream. He inherited the discipline to make it real. From his fortress at Istakur, Ardashir gathered soldiers from the highlands, trained them in the tactics of both steppe and city, and forged alliances with local nobles, disillusioned by Arsacid complacency. His armies moved with the precision of a craftsman's hand, measured, deliberate, and unstoppable. In Ctesiphon, the court dismissed these reports as provincial disturbances. The king, now Artabanus IV, had grown accustomed to quelling rebellions with words rather than weapons. Yet Ardashir was not another restless satrap. Within a decade, his forces had conquered Fars, Elimes, and much of Persis. Temple inscriptions from Tangi Sarvak record his victories in carved reliefs, riders galloping beneath the flames of victory, nobles bowing before the new lord of the south. For the first time in centuries, an Iranian ruler spoke not of survival, but of destiny. When Ardashir proclaimed himself King of Kings in 220 AD, the world began to tilt. The title had long belonged to the Arsacids, yet few had truly deserved it. Now, carved upon cliffs and echoed in temples, it declared a new power rising from the ruins of the old. His messengers carried edicts across the plateau, demanding recognition. Some governors submitted readily, others fled. Artabanus gathered his armies too late. The final confrontation came at a place called Hormozgan, near the old caravan routes of Fars. There, in 224 AD, the armies of two dynasties faced one another beneath a sky heavy with dust and omen. Artabanus commanded the traditional Parthian cavalry, cataphracts gleaming in mail, their lances long as banners, their archers poised behind. Ardashir led a smaller, disciplined force drawn from the highlands, armored in bronze and faith. The clash was short, brutal, decisive. Chroniclers write that when the dust settled, Artabanus lay among his fallen nobles, pierced by a spear. His death ended nearly 5 centuries of Arsacid rule. The surviving nobles, unwilling to die for a memory, rode to Ardashir's camp and offered allegiance. At Ctesiphon, the fire temples were rededicated and a new dynasty was proclaimed. The Sasanian Empire, heir to Persia, reborn. For the Parthians, it was both an ending and a return. The house of Arsaces, born from rebellion against foreign governors, perished under the same conditions that had birthed it: local discontent, divided loyalty, and a yearning for unity. Yet their legacy did not vanish. The new rulers adopted much of what their predecessors had built: the system of noble estates, the mixture of Greek and Iranian administration, the cavalry tactics that had humbled Rome. The Parthian world, though conquered, survived in the bones of the empire that replaced it. In the western provinces, word of the fall spread slowly. Merchants in Seleucia still traded as if nothing had changed. Priests in Babylon still tended ancient altars. To them, dynasties came and went like seasons. Only in the highlands did the shock truly register. In the mountain fortresses of Hyrcania and Media, old banners were taken down, new ones raised. For the first time in centuries, Persia, not Parthia, would speak for the Iranian world. The Tang-e Sarvak reliefs, carved into living rock, remain the only surviving Parthian record of those final years. They show kings offering fire to the heavens, warriors in armor facing each other beneath winged symbols of divinity. The figures are rigid, timeless, caught between pride and resignation. They speak of a people who understood that empires, like flames, burn brightest before they fade. When Ardashir entered Ctesiphon, he did not destroy the city. He restored it, consecrated it anew, and proclaimed himself heir to both Cyrus and Arsaces. The coronation was a fusion of eras. Zoroastrian priests anointed the new king, beside Greek-speaking scribes who recorded the decree. Noble houses swore fealty in the language of the steppe and the sanctuary. Out of Parthia's ashes, a more centralized, ambitious empire rose, one that would dominate the East for the next 4 centuries. The Arsacid line lingered only in the north, where its branches ruled Armenia and the Caucasus for generations to come. Yet even there, their titles, King of Kings, Son of Arsaces, became ceremonial echoes of a vanished glory. As the 3rd century dawned, travelers along the Euphrates found the same roads, the same markets, the same stars, but the world beneath them had changed. The age of the horse archers had yielded to the age of kings robed in fire. The Parthians had not fallen in disgrace. They had been absorbed into a story larger than their own. At dusk, when the winds swept through the ruins of Nisa, it was said the sound of hooves could still be heard, the ghosts of riders who had once ruled from the deserts to the sea. Their empire was gone, but its rhythm remained in the dust, in the curve of the bow, in the memory of freedom that no conquest could quite erase. The death of Artabanus IV ended the rule of the Arsacids, but not the life of Parthia. Empires rarely die cleanly. Their bones become the foundations of what follows. When Ardashir rode through the gates of Ctesiphon in triumph, he proclaimed the dawn of a new Persian era. Yet his banners fluttered over a world the Parthians had made. Its roads, its cities, its customs, and its habits of power, all born from the 5 centuries that had come before. The Sasanian kings who followed him would call themselves heirs of Cyrus, restorers of ancient Persia, but they ruled in the Parthian image more than they cared to admit. The very title, King of Kings, which Ardashir revived as a symbol of rebirth, had never vanished. It had lived through the Arsacid age, inscribed on coins and whispered in councils. The satrapal system, the network of noble families bound to the crown by privilege and rivalry, remained intact. The court at Ctesiphon, rebuilt under new rulers, was filled with the same clans that had once served the Arsacids, the Surin, the Karen, the Mihran. The dynasty had changed, the architecture of authority had not. Even the Sasanian army bore the stamp of its predecessors. The cataphracts, perfected by Parthian generals, remained the spine of imperial warfare. Their scale armor, their long lances, their terrifying discipline, these became the model for every heavy cavalry from the Danube to the Indus. Centuries later, the Byzantines and Persians would still meet each other on battlefields shaped by Arsacid invention. Horse archers wheeling around armored lancers, tactics born from the steppe but refined in Parthia's plains. Yet the Parthians' legacy was not only martial, their genius lay in adaptation. They had taken the ruins of Alexander's empire and forged a realm that married Greek administration with Iranian tradition. They had ruled from twin capitals, Seleucia and Ctesiphon, one facing west, the other east. They had spoken in many tongues and governed through compromise rather than compulsion. Theirs was an empire that survived not by purity but by balance. That same balance would define Persian and Central Asian civilization for centuries. The coexistence of East and West, desert and city, nomad and priest. In art and language, their influence endured even longer. The Parthian script, written in flowing lines and angled strokes, became the ancestor of later Middle Persian writing. The frontal, solemn style of Parthian sculpture, figures standing rigid and timeless, reappeared in the reliefs of the Sasanian kings. Even the imagery of power remained unchanged. The ruler framed by fire, the divine hand descending from the heavens, the gesture of benediction mirrored from one dynasty to the next. Beyond Iran, Arsacid blood flowed through other thrones. In Armenia, a branch of the family continued to rule for centuries, blending Hellenistic culture with Iranian ritual. Their court at Artaxata carried forward the Parthian model of noble councils and hereditary estates. In the Caucasus, smaller Arsacid offshoots ruled Albania and Iberia, their names preserved in chronicles long after Parthia itself was a memory. In these mountain kingdoms, the Arsacid name outlived the empire's frontiers. For the Romans, the memory of Parthia was both humiliation and fascination. The eagles lost at Kari, the endless duels along the Euphrates, the uneasy peace of Augustus, all became chapters in a story of rivalry that would continue under the Sasanians. Yet the Romans also borrowed from their old enemy, the organization of mounted units, the diplomacy of Eastern courts, even the imagery of divine kingship. The boundaries drawn in the sands of Mesopotamia remained the line where two worlds touched and learned from each other. Historians of later ages often dismissed the Arsacids as interlopers, as a bridge between two greater empires, the Achaemenid and the Sasanian. But bridges are not lesser things. They hold weight. The Parthians preserved Iranian identity through centuries of Hellenistic dominance, keeping alive the idea that Persia could be both Eastern and cosmopolitan, loyal to its gods yet open to the world. They proved that conquest could be absorbed, that empire could coexist with diversity. Their monuments were not as grand as Persepolis, nor their chronicles as polished as Rome's annals, yet their achievement was quieter and deeper. They kept the center of the world alive. When the Sasanian banners rose, they did so over a land still humming with Parthian roads, Parthian cities, Parthian spirit. Even their defeats became legend. The fall at Hormozgan was remembered not as collapse, but as transformation. In the carvings of Fars, Ardashir's victory scenes echo older Parthian reliefs. The same riders, the same altars, the same flames. Conquest in Iran was never erasure, it was inheritance. Centuries later, travelers from the West who followed the old Silk Road would find traces of Parthia everywhere, in the domed sanctuaries of Yazd, in the stone carvings of Armenia, in the curved bows of steppe horsemen. Their story did not end. It diffused, mingling with every civilization that passed through the lands they had once ruled. The empire that began with a nomad's rebellion ended as a memory woven into the fabric of half the known world. From the deserts of Turkmenistan to the gardens of Ctesiphon, from the walls of Hatra to the markets of Babylon, their legacy lingered in gesture, custom, and faith. To the Persians who came after, the Arsacids were both warning and foundation, proof that empire must bend to endure, that kingship without renewal becomes its own ruin. To the rest of the world, they stood as the hinge between antiquity's two great visions, Rome's ambition and Persia's endurance. And so, though their crown was lost, their rhythm continued. The bowstrings twang, the thunder of hooves across open plains, the flicker of sacred fire against desert wind, all spoke of a people who had refused to vanish. Between Greece and Persia, between East and West, they built an empire of endurance, and in that endurance lies their immortality.